Excellent. All right. So today's webinar is the third and final installment of our 2022 series on financial sustainability for conservation burial grounds. Today we will be talking about investments for growing endowment, perpetual care, and other CBG funds. Hopefully you were able to join us for our previous two sessions, but if not, those recordings of those webinars can be viewed by CBA members and anyone who paid for the registration fee for those webinars. Today, we are going to address some of the ways that conservation burial grounds are implementing financial investment plans in order to fulfill their perpetual obligations, not only to the people that they serve, but also to the conservation land that they manage. So as always, we will start with a little bit of introduction and housekeeping. So first, let me introduce myself. My name is Amy Henriksen. I am the steward for Kokosing Nature Preserve in Gambier, Ohio, and I will be your moderator again today for this webinar. I am one of the founding members of the Conservation Burial Alliance, and you will be hearing today from two other members, founding members of the CBA during this webinar. Jeff Maston is a co-founder of Land Matters, conservation consulting firm, and also Blue Stem Conservation Cemetery in Cedar Grove, North Carolina. Freddie Johnson is one of the founders of Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery in Gainesville, Florida. And Laura Starkey is the founder and executive director of Heartwood Preserve in Trinity, Florida, and she has also played a key role in developing today's webinar as well as the first two webinars in this series. And she is here as well tonight and will be adding her thoughts and perspectives during the Q&A session. If you've watched all three of these webinars, these are all familiar faces to you. So a few other housekeeping items before we get started. We do want to note, as always, as we've noted on our prior webinars as well, that we are sharing our collective experience as practitioners of conservation burial. This is a reminder once again that you should definitely keep in mind that suggestions we make here should be weighed as to their relevance to your particular conservation burial project in your particular state. As you follow along this evening, if you could please type any of your questions or comments in the chat, that would be great. We will have time for plenty of questions and discussion at the end. For this session, we have actually tried to keep our presentation to 45 minutes or so. And then for this final session, that will leave a little extra time for questions and conversation at the end. So hopefully about 45 minutes. So with that said, let's dive into the material for today's topic. As I said, in today's webinar, Investments for Growing Your CBG, we will be discussing some of the ways that conservation burial grounds are implementing investment plans, allowing them to fulfill their obligations, their perpetual obligations to the people they serve and the conservation land that they manage. When we talk about investment funds for conservation burial grounds, first and foremost, we are typically talking about perpetual care funds. Perpetual care funds are endowed funds, typically required by state law. And there are specific rules and policies that must be followed related to things such as the required size of the endowment, how the funds are invested and managed, when deposits to the principal balance must be made, how and when, and if income earned is to be distributed and used, et cetera, et cetera. The income earned is what is used for the continual care of the land, the burial ground, and also for needs related to the public use of that land. So again, as an endowed fund, we're using that interest, not the principal. We did cover perpetual care funds pretty extensively in webinar series 2. So if you weren't able to join us for that, I would definitely direct you to the recording of that webinar. For more information, we won't go into we won't reiterate that detail here tonight. So what we haven't focused on yet, and what we're going to look at here this evening, are other possible dedicated investment funds, which can be useful for conservation burial grounds in a number of other ways, with or without being a formal endowment fund. Some examples include just a general investment fund designated for excess funds that are over and above what is typically needed in the operating account. These funds would be accessible for use in many different ways and for many purposes, including possibly even future transfers back to the operating account if necessary. An emergency or crisis fund for unexpected expenses, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Capital improvement fund for potential building projects, improving or expanding your existing buildings or facilities, or possibly building new. Land fund, so for long-term goals potentially of expanding your operations, possibly purchasing more conservation land. And then another example would be potentially an indigent burial program to provide assistance with burial expenses for individuals and families with demonstrated financial need. And these funds can be established and designated as separate funds, separate individual funds, or they could be separate uses within a single larger umbrella fund. As we were chatting and preparing this webinar this evening, I think it was Freddie who brought up the very good point that it would be short-sighted of us to talk about growing our investment if we didn't also talk about the importance of minimizing the liabilities that could threaten conservation burial grounds financial stability and growth. So just wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit about that before we move on to continuing to talk about our investments. Important first to look at our internal vulnerabilities. And first and foremost, important to create a culture of safety within your conservation burial ground for our staff and for our volunteers. There should be policies and procedures for safe practices in place. Training and refresher trainings on those safe practices should be conducted regularly. And the policies and procedures themselves should be revisited and consistently reviewed and updated if necessary. Additionally, it's critical that your organization is well-versed and operates within the appropriate state and federal requirements. This sort of goes back to my disclaimer at the beginning of this presentation that it's important that for your specific project, you really need to know those laws and regulations specific to your state for your operations. With regard to external threats, I'm sure this is not an exhaustive list, but some examples that we thought of might include potential breach in data security or information security, accidents with staff, accidents with visitors, public relations disasters, could include negative reviews from unsatisfied customers or other bad press, justified or not, acts of vandalism to the cemetery. Those are a few examples of some external threats. So then the question is, how do we protect against these threats and vulnerabilities? We do this through a variety of ways, but primarily through insurance. So liability insurance, workers' comp insurance, property insurance, directors and officers insurance, etc. So very important. And then also, as I mentioned previously, you could establish a crisis fund or an emergency fund to help in the event of some of these threats or unexpected situations. And then establishing a trusted relationship with legal counsel is extremely important, and possibly establishing a fund for legal defense funds as well. And then those policies that we talked about, those internal policies and procedures that will help minimize your vulnerabilities as well, safety protocols, IT policy, etc. So at this point, with that being said, I am going to turn it over to Freddie to talk a little bit more about management of our investment funds.
Thanks, Amy. So in relation to some of the funds that Amy talked about, but really any fund is going to require management from some group of people or organizations. And one of those is an organization, whether for-profit or nonprofit, is to have a financial committee. And that could include board members or a mix of board members and non-board members. Technically, it could even be all non-members, board members, or I haven't seen that, but it could be done, I'm sure. And their role in the management of these funds may not be hands-on and active. It could be more passive and more like an oversight. So that can vary as to how active they are in the management. Another possibility of involvement is having a certified financial planner. And here again, that financial planner could be an individual, it could be an organization, and they also could be a part of the, as we spoke of above, the financial committee, but they also may not necessarily be a part of the financial committee. That really depends on how, once again, every organization has their own preferences and own culture and how they might want to do this. The important thing is to have a discussion and decide how you want to build your financial sustainability and management of funds. A community foundation, which is typically a nonprofit organization that is very vested in helping the community and area nonprofits, and as well as other community programs, but they vary in terms of how broad of services that they do and what they get involved with. But it can be a very good thing to check out. A lot of times they can be involved in management of funds and even offering of funds. And there's other benefits about community foundations that I think will come up later in this webinar or in discussion. And then there's the board of directors of whether it be a nonprofit organization or for-profit. You can have board of directors for either one, and board of directors are often to some degree involved in the management of funds. Once again, if not entirely active, at least in an oversight and sometimes receiving a type of information from maybe a financial committee. It might be a proposal, and they may have the final word about things and policies involved in the management of those funds. Let's take a look at slide 9. This is the first one here, the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, or MIFA, is something that I hesitated to even mention, but the more I thought about it, it's worth knowing about, which I didn't know about until I started doing a little research for this particular webinar. And this is actually law in 49 states, not Pennsylvania or Puerto Rico, but all the others. And it probably is not specifically and directly related to conservation burial ground organizations, nonprofits, but it does have some good information in terms of learning about prudent guidelines for developing specific policies and for fund management. So you can just Google it. It came up for me, and there's lots of information on it. And as I say, it's not so much about something you need to worry about as it is something to learn from or get ideas from, possibly. The other considerations are, most of the time, not all the time, you want to have goals for each fund in terms of target amounts. And that might over time be adjusted. But as with any planning, it's good to have some specific goals to shoot for, particularly if you're fundraising. So the other point here about appropriate fund specific investment strategies, that essentially is decided, as we'll talk about, by some of these fund groups of people that are managing the funds, but it's an important aspect of management. Lastly, the evolution of investment plans strategies over time throughout the lifetime of a conservation burial ground. This is, I'm trying to, well, if you think of it in terms of just like a human lifespan in life, you know, you start out saving for retirement. As you get closer to that retirement, the strategies may and often do change. Most importantly, you probably want to take less risk as you get closer to that time frame where you're going to retire, as opposed to earlier you might take more risk so that you might accumulate more gain earlier when you've got time to deal with the outcome, positive or negative. At this point, I think that I would like to share a video coming directly from Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery's certified financial planner. His name is Tim Rourke, and he actually is, as I spoke of earlier, he's a member of, he's not a board member, but he is a member of Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery's financial committee. And I think everybody else on that committee is a board member. Tim serves as the committee's advisor. So without further ado, here's a video straight from Tim.
Hello, my name is Tim Rourke. I'm a financial advisor at Koss Olinger in Gainesville, Florida, and I'm also on the finance committee for Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery. It's a mouthful. And that's what I'm here today to talk about. I'm going to share a little bit of my background and what we've done with Prairie Creek and how that may be helpful to you, or why you potentially might want to use a financial advisor or someone like me in helping out your organization. So I'm going to share a couple documents. Don't worry, you don't need to read these, but more so I just want to show you that we have them. A couple of things that we've tried to do with Prairie Creek is create a little bit of a structure and kind of having a strategy, a game plan, so that we can be intentional with the dollars that we have to utilize them as best as possible for both today, for the next 5 years, and ultimately for the next 20 to 25 years. And so that's really what this is. Nothing fancy, but you know, kind of just a one-pager, a quick game plan stating that, okay, we have cash, we're keeping that in cash, we want to make sure that that's there so that we can run the day-to-day operations. And then as we have different accounts with different time horizons, then we are utilizing different vehicles to try to grow those dollars over time. And so we have another account that has a 1 to 5 year time horizon, relatively short term, and so that money is invested, yet fairly conservative because we don't want to be taking on a bunch of risk. We have another account that has a 5 year plus time horizon that is a little bit more aggressive, and that one we're up to 60% equities, 40% fixed income. And then we have a longer term account, which we call it our endowment account, which, you know, that's something we're trying to grow for the 20 years out, to where hopefully those dollars can ultimately sustain the organization. And so that account is 100% equities. And you know, what's more important than what the equity allocation is for any of these accounts is really just that we have a strategy and it's automated. We revisit this quarterly. We look at the underlying investments and the strategies, and we always ask ourselves, do we need to make any changes? And my question to the group is, have our goals changed? And if our goals haven't changed, then as long as the underlying investments are performing as they should be, given the current market conditions, then we don't make any changes. We let our goals dictate the investment decisions, not just our feelings about what the market may or may not do this year. In addition to kind of just an overall strategy, is we also want to have an investment policy statement for each account. Again, the details are not overly important. We're happy to share those if people would like, but it's just having a documented strategy in place so that it's not kind of willy-nilly. We have, we kind of seen some committees where it might be John, who's a builder, and Tom, who's a banker, and they get together and then they're picking different stocks for the funds to be invested in, which is not really a sound strategy. So I really encourage you to have some type of investment professional. I'm a certified financial planner, CFP. That's a popular designation that is someone that can kind of look at the organization and put together a big picture plan to help you and your organization thrive as much as possible moving into the future. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your time. Hello, my name is
There we go. So moving on to investment fund policies. The investment fund that are set up, regardless of what the purpose or combination of purposes, you need to have an investment plan, as Tim spoke to, that's appropriate for that particular designated fund. And there could be also an investment policy and rules that are allowed based on the organization values. It's not something that you have to do, but in other words, what I'm talking about is it might be that you can only invest in a certain appropriate funds that are aligned with the value of the organization. Once again, not something you have to do, but it is probably something that is worthy of a conversation. And it could be meaningful for the organization to ask the question and discuss it. It's important to have clear policies that provide protocols for how and when funds can be utilized, as well as how and when contributions can be made to the fund and when and how that will occur. So the upcoming slide will I think help show that as a better example. If we can go to the next slide, and this slide, thank you to Baldwin Hill Conservation Cemetery, because this is sort of an outline of their investment policy with different categories that make up. This is not, it's like, several pages long, and we're not going to go into the details, but what I wanted to do was to just kind of show these are all categories that have language in their investment policy and specific, policies and things that they will and won't do. First of all, at least for now, they identified two funds: the operating fund for doing business. That's what Tim spoke of. I think he just called it a cash fund, but it's an operating fund. And then they also have their perpetual care fund, which is the equivalent of an endowment. And then under delegation, this really defines, here again, it's what we've kind of already gone over. It actually defines who's responsible for the management of these funds, and it provides details and protocols in that regard. Investment policy and objectives. Obviously, it indicates what they're trying to do and what might have their goals, and a lot of details about that. But it also in there, in fact, I know I've read it, they have language talking about how they, as much as possible, want to have socially responsible investments. Asset allocation, you heard Tim speak a little bit about allocation, and those are the parameters of investment as to which type of investments are appropriate, how much investment is appropriate in a particular category, like fixed income versus equities, and other alternatives like maybe real estate or cash or certificates of deposit. So, and there's lots and lots of ways to allocate assets, but each organization's financial committee or group who's doing this needs to make sure that they, as Tim said, document what they want to do can all be changed later and monitored and reviewed, but it's very important to have appropriate asset allocation. And risk tolerance, you heard Tim speak of risk tolerance, and there again, that also relates to timelines. Strategic rebalancing is all about how over time, you've created this strategy and you've created these allocations and percentages, and things get out of balance. Like maybe your equities has grown to the point that it's no longer 40%, it's now 70%. So rebalancing, you need to sell, you stick to your plan or change your plan, but usually, at least for a while, you want to stick to your plan and do rebalancing so you're back in sync with what your strategy was originally planned for. Spending policy, that's rules for when and how the funds can spend money. A lot of different possibilities in there on spending interest, or when and what time you could actually touch principal. The cash flow requirements is a lot of times mostly about budget kind of details, and reporting requirements and benchmarks or protocols for monitoring the funds, and often going over fund performance to see if there needs to be changes made or not. And lastly, investment policy adoption and review. Essentially, there again, it's a review and time to look at what's going on and in the time frames, and it also is a time to change rules if it looks like some rules need to be changed or adapted. Next slide. And next slide is in terms of where to do this investing and how to be connected with the opportunity to do these kind of investments and where those lie. And first of all, if you're doing a state mandated like a perpetual care fund or an endowment and it's state mandated, typically if it's state mandated, those choices that you have of different ways to invest, there might be some choices there, but they're going to be given to you by the state language or the statute or the department that's overseeing. So that's pretty easy. You still might have some choices, but it's going to be right there for you to look at. But for other funds, and for those funds like Prairie Creek, which is, even though Florida has state mandated funds, Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery is an exempt cemetery, so it doesn't apply to them. But we actually use the state mandates to formulate our own, and we have actually more choices for investment. So some of the things that we use and have used, or we've looked at community foundations, which I recommend that if there's one near you, definitely check out community foundations. They offer a lot of benefits, and it could be prudent to meet with them to learn about what they have to offer. They also are a great source for making valuable contacts and social engagements, and promoting nonprofits in their community and creating partners. So a lot of benefits in many areas to community foundations. Brokerage firms are pretty much the most common for a lot of these funds to be involved with brokerage firms so that they can make the investments they want to make and have a lot of diversification in those investments. There's plenty of choices out there. They're just to name a few, Schwab and E-Trade, those two come to mind, but there's a bunch more. And some are more welcoming than others to nonprofits and organizations, and some, have a certain financial amount of money that needs to be in-house before you can open an account with them, but some not. Some it's very easy. So you just have to check them out. Then there's local banks and credit unions who often are a good place to begin. And most all organizations, they start maybe with just a bank or a credit union that's local with a checking account. But as time goes on, these banks and credit unions also, you can check and see what they have to offer in terms of investments. They almost all have CBs, and many of them now have departments where fund investment is a possibility. But you do have to watch out a lot of times with banks and credit unions for fees that you might not have to pay with a brokerage firm. And then there's all kinds of combinations of the above. Just because you have a bank and credit union it doesn't keep you from having a brokerage account too. Prairie Creek has a bank account that they do their regular operations through, and then all of our other funds are with Schwab. And that works well for Prairie Creek, but everything is relative to your organization and how you want to do things. And as time goes on, a lot of times, some of these funds, you can actually set up the goal of the fund and your policies, even though you're not ready to actually invest yet. It's really good to go ahead and think about what funds are going to be appropriate for your conservation burial ground in the future, and be ready when the time comes. I think I'd like to turn it over to Jeff now for the next slide. Jeff, you still around?
I am. I'm here.
Good.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to discuss, this is specifically for those in a position of accepting donations, nonprofits. Donations are kind of an important revenue stream that offer potential for engaging the community to financially support your burial ground or the specific projects as they develop. There's great responsibility and accountability that comes with accepting these donations, and wanted to discuss that a little bit. It's important to have a defined procedure in place to receive donations, to provide the appropriate recognition of the gift. It's important that the organization and the donor provide this so that the potential tax deductions with the IRS and other government agencies are recognized. A kind of a critical and often overlooked responsibility of the recipient of a gift is to ensure that if it's accepted and a specific donation intent or donor intent of the donation needs to be upheld, and the money needs to be used in very specific ways, which was structured by the donor with their intent. If the fund is given with a specific purpose in mind, the recipient, when accepting the gift, is obligated to use those funds as they were intended. And this is a critical point it's just often overlooked, and it's also something that really needs to be codified in your records, because some gifts come in and they might stay with the organization for years even, and people change in staff positions, and folks forget the donor intent all along. So make sure that you codify the donor intent in your organizational records, and potentially even segregate the funds. At a minimum, you need to segregate them within your books, and you can also segregate them in different accounts within institutions. If you really can't live up to the donor expectations, then the gift shouldn't have been accepted in the first place. You can always call a donor and ask to repurpose that gift, but recognize that the discretion is theirs and the choice is theirs on whether that's possible. Most organizations seek to maximize unrestricted giving in lieu of restricted gifts wherever possible, for the reason of not having to manage all these restrictions. It's also helpful to have policies in place to pre-plan what you do with large unexpected gifts. although it's not required, it can be beneficial to have guidance for the leadership as a gift comes in. For example, perhaps your organization has a policy that large unsolicited gifts are broken down by some formula. Say 50% go to the general fund, 25% go to the affordability or the conservation fund, and 25% go to the board reserve. The guidance that you provide in having a policy streamlines the decision process and eliminates the confusion and problems. Perhaps a donor decides to give a piece of land as an asset. What would you do then? How would you monetize that so that it can benefit your organization? Maybe you need a policy or to kind of really think this through ahead of time. Policies can also help guide you, particularly if there are conflicts in what people believe should be done with gifts as they come in, and they really just eliminate a lot of the guesswork. But think stability, think strategically. That's kind of how all of these pieces kind of fit together. So bequests are definitely a strategic gift, and there's no specific understanding of the timing of when a bequest will come in, but it is as a package of the different kinds of donations. Bequests can really have a significant impact on your organization, obviously depending on the size. It can be really transformative. They follow their own timeline. There are things you can do to prepare yourself to benefit from the generosity of a bequest. First of all, you can talk to people about giving in their wills, but create a policy, create kind of language, bequest language that you can provide to someone and have prepared for the conversation should they arise. Should you be listed in a will as a future recipient, ask the donor if they would provide you with a page, that page from the will that states the language, just to give you a better indication of what the potential gift is and how you can actually schedule that as part of your system. So also remember that bequests are intentions. But a will can change over time. So you can be in a bequest in someone's giving plan, but then they can actually change their mind. And so it's not a sure thing by any means. And then there's charitable remainder trusts. These are kind of less common, but still important potential tools where essentially someone creates this trust, and then the charitable remainder trust actually gives a certain amount of money to the donor over time. And then once they pass away, or once some trigger window timeline or something like that occurs, then all of the remainder, the charitable remainder within that trust actually gets then provided to or donated to the organization that was designated as the recipient. And so it's another financial tool. It's much less. So your board leadership should be aware that there are a multitude of different tools that are out there, and that these are kind of potential benefits, but they also come with their own levels of responsibility. May have a role to play in determining how you utilize the funding for strategic purposes for your organization. If you can plan on something that's coming in the future, you can think about your strategy for growth, or for creating your endowments, or even augmenting your endowments to ensure that you have future funding to be a stable organization. Next slide. So lastly, we wanted to discuss kind of that condition most every cemetery will come to at some point in time, which is, what do you do when you're near capacity? What are your plans? When do you start thinking about this, to consider whether you are just going to sunset your burial ground as it fills up, or are you going to perhaps grow it with neighboring lands, or even create a new conservation burial ground? So these are kind of, again, getting to the level of strategic thinking. It's a reason. The reason to think about this is some of the tools that we've been discussing beforehand can actually play a role in how you then think through your future. If you know that you potentially want to develop a conservation burial ground in the future, another one, then perhaps you set aside funds to acquire land for that future burial ground, or you may want to develop staff to someone who could support this new operation within your organization. And so you might think of ways in which you're developing your human resource as part of it, or your programmatic resources to take care of it as well. So I'm not going to go through each one of these, but there are considerations to thinking about not just what you're doing today, but also what you're doing tomorrow and 10 years from now, or in the case of many cemeteries, we're talking about beyond our lifetime, like 50 and 100 years from now. And I think it's critical that you don't just kick the can down the road. You start to think about the ways in which your organization can set up the future board for success by having thought through some of these critical components. So with that, I'm going to kick it back over to Amy, and we'll lead into our question and answer period.
All right, thank you very much. So that concludes our materials for this webinar regarding investments for growing your conservation burial ground. We have left plenty of time for questions related to this evening's topic. If you have burning questions that you've thought of and follow up to webinars number 1 and 2, certainly feel free to bring those up as well. Perhaps we have anticipated and answered all of the questions at this point, and we can call it a day. Somehow I doubt that, though. All right, we do have one question in the chat. How did you get started with seed money? Did you develop friends of the CBA? And what point in the organization's development, and did they offer gratitude in the form of perhaps a burial for big donors? So anyone want to chat about?
Could you maybe take us out of the screen share so we can see each other's
Absolutely.
faces? That'd be great.
Well,
I sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
No, go for it, sir.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's a good question, because I think it will probably illustrate what we've reiterated many times in these webinars, and that is that every situation, every move, every beginning, and thereafter is its own individual energy and development. And even though there are in common, I guess, characteristics and goals and very important things that must happen across the board, oftentimes the startup energy and situation can be very different, and that leads to very different operations. And it's not, I think that actually is a strength for conservation burial. It's not, as long as we have those really core values and core things that we know have to be, as Jeff spoke of, that this is obligatory, and this is actually what we're all about. And this is, as long as we have that, a lot of the other variations and is a really an example of strength through diversification in many ways, and also comes together for us as strength when we collaborate. But speaking for Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery as one of the founders, I can tell you that it mostly was about community and enthusiasm, and just pulling, started with a very small group of 3 and going to a local land trust. And one of them was a leader of the land trust, so that helped a lot. And then going to county commissioners and going to different groups. But when Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery started, I can't remember, how much of a fund that we had, but I can guarantee it was less than $10,000. But we also, we didn't have a financial commitment as seed money. What we had was a great partner who was excited and committed, and that was a land trust, who was willing to be our partner and let us use their land, and it wasn't too many years after that we together bought more land from the burial fees. And I think what was really important for Prairie Creek is the commitment that, when we all recognized, and we had a board at this point, and we were a nonprofit organization, we basically said, look, if this is going to succeed, we all have to be willing to be a working board. I mean, we have to be willing to dig graves. We have to be willing to go out and talk to groups, and we have to be willing to do burials. And actually, we all were very excited to do that. And because the whole foundation of our group was enthusiasm. So that's what I want to share.
I'll add just a little, because I've actually just gone through this. So Bluestem Conservation Cemetery just raised, $900,000 to build a conservation burial ground, and it started very grassroots. It started $1 by $1 by $1, and we did create a gift chart with different rates of goals of how we wanted to, how many gifts of $5,000, how many gifts of $10,000, how many gifts of $1,000, how many gifts of $25,000 and more. And we did create offerings for larger donors that included the potential for getting a reduced rate, or in for a large enough gift, a burial plot as part of the gift. So, someone who does that, though, they don't get to count that entire gift, right? The IRS says you can't count that entire gift. You can count the portions of that gift, except for the benefit of this, free burial, or not free burial plot, but burial plot that is part of the program. And honestly, most of the large gifts, folks didn't really even want to take advantage of what we were offering. They were doing it because they believed in our mission, they believed in our values and our goals. But several people did, and so if you, I can't remember the numbers offhand, but if you, I don't know, if you gave $10,000, you get like a 30% off a burial plot or something like that. And we had several people take advantage of that. And I think, you have to just figure out what's right in your community with your folks, and what they're looking for and what you're looking for. And, ultimately you're trying to raise a certain amount of money to acquire land, or to buy a piece of equipment, or to create enough operating capital so that you can survive your first couple of years with a good adequate cash flow, and you're not necessarily the more you raise, the less you borrow. So that's in the nonprofit world, and really in the for-profit side, you can you can borrow from other people and, as an investment strategy, and you pay folks back. And there's just different ways that you can approach these things. And it can be very, very successful. And but it takes a heck of a lot of work to do that too.
Laura, do you have anything you want to add from your experience?
Yeah, I have a very different startup story than that. So there are different ways to do it. I didn't have the community of a nonprofit community or grassroots community to do that with. I think it's amazing what Blue Stem has been able to do in the last few years with raising that. It's incredible. So we just don't have that kind of grassroots conservation community here. I started it as basically doing kind of a legacy gift myself with some family funds that I had. So an opportunity to have the land that was part of my family. So I had a unique situation. So whatever your situation is for access to the piece of land that you may be looking at or working with, that's going to be different for everybody. I will say for making the decision to go with a for-profit model instead of a nonprofit model. Someone asks on here about doing a B Corp format. The B Corp format is basically as I understand it, it's a process. Once you got up and going, you fill out an information form of like, hey, are you doing it in these most awesome company practices way? And then if you fill out that questionnaire and you fill out that process, which I just have frankly not had the time or bandwidth to be able to do that, to be officially a B Corp. But I'm following those types of practices of things just as what I would call a social enterprise. So there is good to be done in this world or any other type of business in a for-profit manner. Not only nonprofits don't have the corner on the market of goodness and doing these businesses as most people that are familiar with both, it's really just your structure. So there is a ramp up time with setting our pricing with getting going as a for-profit. There is the startup funding. If you can borrow, what I was kind of advised is if you can borrow money from friends and family I'm talking about from a for-profit standpoint, not donations, fundraising like Jeff was talking about, but trying to raise that seed money. If you've got friends and family or close, people that can be part of your seed money that way, then you're not, as opposed to business loans. I mean, there are ways you can do business loans just like any business startup, but fortunately, I was able to, with another family member and other personal access to some funds, did not have to do a business loan. But if you do business loans, of course, you have to figure in your return rate of your interests on repaying that loan. So, it's just kind of following the starting a small business format with looking for your funding for a for-profit model. The advantage, in my opinion, for a for-profit model is you're not dependent on, you have a little bit more nimble practices in terms of you're able to make decisions of, instead of having to, not to get into any, better than, worse than thing about for-profit versus nonprofit, but there is some nimbleness of being able to make the decisions as the director of, okay, we're going to go with this contractor, or we're going to go with this decision on the design of the building or the pavement of the road, or how we're going to do the site development, things like that. So it's got its, benefits and limitations. There is a question about the 501c13 versus 501c3. That's out of my realm. That would be in the Freddie or someone else's category.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Both the 501c3 and 501c13 are charitable nonprofit. They're all under that heading of tax, you can make contributions and get tax deductions. But there is a difference. A 501c3 is really looking at purely public charity and education, whereas a 501c13 is very explicitly a nonprofit cemetery. So some of the differences that are worthy of note is if a person or a business just makes a straight donation, then they can have a tax, that can be tax deductible donation, 1C3. But if you're like a lot of folks that they have accounts with brokerage firms that have, I'm trying to think of the name of this, Jeff, you can help me maybe, or Laura or some Amy, but it's essentially somewhat like for a whole year, you make your charitable donation, you get your tax deduction, but it's held by a trust that's a donor trust. A lot of times, once again, brokerage firms handle this. So for whatever reason, if a donation comes from one of those donor trusts, a 501c13 is not eligible to take it. It has to be a 501c3. And that may be law, but if it's not law, it's certainly standard with all of those firms we've learned through Prairie Creek. That's where it's really nice to have a 501c3 as a partner, which is Alachua Conservation Trust for us, because Alachua Conservation Trust can take that donation the donor fund will work with them fine. And then in our case, this could work in many ways, but in our case, Alachua Conservation Trust is happy to take it because they designate it. They restrict that donation for Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery, which is their land anyway, for the most part. So we work this out with our partner Land Trust so that any kind of thing like this will be a benefit to us both. And that money.
We lose Freddie.
Oh, he froze up.
The other thing I want to say about C13s is that the funds, and I think this is true, the funds really have to stay within the organization. And so you can't, for example, generate revenue for your 501c13 and then send those funds outside the organization. They're really intended for the long-term care and maintenance and operation of that organization. So it's really self-contained and structured, and that in itself really has to bounce up against what your concept is and your values are and what you're trying to design and develop. So that might define whether you go down the C13 or C3 route, but the two can also work together. So you could create a C3 and a C13 and have them work together, and one of them supports the other as well. So that's also possible. And there's lots of, the neat thing is there are very creative ways of doing all of this. You just have to think it through and be very strategic about it.
Yeah.
And if I could
go ahead.
Go
Laura.
ahead. Okay, let me add real quick. Sorry. The community foundation we mentioned earlier in the talk is an example of, like, for example, with Heartwood, as I mentioned, as you know, we're a for-profit, but I'm on the verge of hoping to open some type of a trust or a fund that would be through, I'm looking probably at doing it through the Community Foundation of Tampa Bay, that would not be related to the business of the operations of the cemetery, which is the sales and the actual cemetery business, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, is a business of doing the operations. But there are other things such as a tree planting, perhaps, or a memorial program, or the indigent fund for people, that might want to donate to help support people who can't afford to pay for the services or something, or whatever, but have a fund that, and I believe I can do this, but I haven't done it yet. So that's my idea is, so even though we're a for-profit operation, that because I've had a few people that have made donations, And I'm like, well, we don't really take donations because we're not a nonprofit, but they're like, take it, we just support what you're doing. And so I put it in a line item, account, so that when we do open up a fund that's like a donor fund, I will put those donations into it for good faith of that's what they intended it for. So it did not go into my operations. So there are some ways I think that we can do some creative things of having, that way it's also people that can really love, if they really love what Heartwood's about or conservation burials about, they can do it in lieu of flowers, consider a donation to the, whatever we would call it, Friends of Heartwood, or the Pinecone Fund, or whatever, something like that. So there are some ways you can do some things that are kind of creative, but that are still, obviously legal and within the realms of your restrictions for whatever corporate structure you have.
I was just going to piggyback on all of that to say just more along the lines of those creative partnerships and how you structure yourself. So we are also unique in that, so Kokosing Nature Preserve is affiliated with Kenyon College. Kenyon is actually our sole member. And then we are also a project of the Philander Chase Conservancy, which is Kenyon College's land trust. So the land trust works to conserve land within a 5-mile radius of the college, trying to keep the college setting rural. It's part of Kenyon's identity. So we are a 501c13. The land trust is a 501c3. We do not accept any charitable gifts to the cemetery. We actually direct our charitable gifts to our land trust. So they then use those gifts to support ongoing land conservation work in the area. And the way we have set up our pricing structure, it's kind of like, it was described to us sort of as that athletic club kind of membership thing. So in order to be eligible to purchase interment rights at Kokosing Nature Preserve at fair market value, you have to make a tax deductible gift of a certain level to the Philander Chase Conservancy. So once that gift has been made, you're eligible to purchase your interment rights at our cemetery. So lots of creative ways to set up these types of situations. So another question related to, just basically talking about all of this. So sort of going back to the basics here, all of this implies that it is safe to assume that launching a CBG with due diligence and a triple P lens is a viable business. So I think that is, yeah, definitely. And, maybe in some years, maybe not so much. And so then, you can go back to some of those overflow funds to help offset the years that maybe not.
And I want to add to that. I mean, a lot of this is dependent on the conditions. So the size and scale of your project has to be commensurate with the potential for you to generate sales. And so if you're in a very rural area, you have to work hard to generate a high level of sales. So that might therefore alter the size or scale of your project. And vice versa. If you're in an urban area and there is a market for what you're considering, then it might offer the opportunity for you to create more programming and more opportunity for that community. And so business planning, Laura said this, and I agree with it, that this is and not nonprofits in general. I mean, they are businesses. You have to ensure that you understand the cash flow and the profit and loss and your balance sheet and all of the above. And so creating a real and viable and realistic projections over a 5 or 10 year projections is really one good way of trying to figure out, is it a viable project for you with all of the assumptions that you've created. And a lot of every business model is based on assumptions. And so are your assumptions realistic for what you're trying to establish?
Right. No money, no mission, right?
Right.
And If I
So
could-
what projection strategies do you recommend to ensure that your modeling is as accurate and dependable as possible?
I'll address that one. I was just looking at that question. As I've looked back on, a few people have asked me, you know, when you look back on your initial projections on your business plan, so how does it look? Like, how are you doing? Like, are you matching it up? And I look back and I'm like, it's totally like an entirely different animal. It's like I was describing a zebra and now I'm writing an antelope. I mean, it's just like what was I thinking? I mean, I was doing the best I could, and that's what projections are. You're just doing the best you can. It wasn't unreasonable. I wouldn't have gotten my license. They fine-tooth combed, looked at my business projections in Tallahassee. I had to go back and redo them. And they still don't look like anything the way it turned out to be, but it was a really important exercise. But this is just kind of a little thing, but I have, even as we got up and running, as I've done my projections, I would get really wrapped around the axle on the pricing between cremation versus full body. And then the opening, because we're selling three things at Heartwood. We're selling the burial rights, or the burial fee, which is the space that you're burying the person in, the opening and closing, which is a service, and then our memorial plaque. Some of y'all, it might be a rock or a stone or something. For us, it's a metal plaque. So those are the three things that we sell. Two of them are required. The third one's optional. So I would get wrapped around like, and then we had pre-need versus at need, and then we have pricing differences. Don't get all wrapped around the axle on that on your projections. You really just want to get an average. And it's just taken me literally since this year to figure out that I've been trying too hard to get just too in the weeds with what those prices are. And I don't know if this is going to make any sense for those of you that haven't gotten here yet, but basically I just figured out what my average price is. Again, this is after I've been in operations, but what my average price is for the burial fee, burial price, because the opening and closing, you're paying for a service that you're going to have should have some markup on it. So there's the true cost of how much you're paying your people and your administrative costs and your digging crew and your equipment. That's your pure cost. And then you're going to have a markup on it just to be able to have some kind of cushion to help support the business. And then consider that just like a wash, even with the markup, consider that like it's paying for itself. And then, you know, the merchandise, which is the plaque, you know, we got a markup, but just consider that kind of doing its own thing. So for me, it was helpful just to do my average of what I'm bringing in on the burial fee. So for us, it's $2,900 is the purchase of a burial space, that burial interment rights. For full body. So yeah, there's a little discount if it's pre-need, and if it's the same full price if it's at need, but then you're putting some in the trust, and the 10% goes into the care and maintenance trust fund. So okay, take $290 off of that. So that's my, you know, so I just used that for my projections of, okay, then you multiply it times how many burial rights purchases you expect to do during that first year, then the second year, and just anticipate, with the exception of if you're Blue Stem, who's like this, are you guys an outlier? Hopefully that's the wave of the future for this, but that was not the reality for us. They're like having people line up at the door for them. You're awesome, but that was not the case here and for a lot of us. So just know that it's going to be anticipate that it'll be kind of a slow ramp up. And then, you know, you'll get up there. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that was kind of, I don't know if that's an official projection strategy, but that's some things that I learned in the last couple of years to just simmer down, simplify it, and then just, you know, use that for your averages for projecting.
The only other thing that I would say is I used a stratified approach where I did a low, medium, high. And really our projection, and the one that we used for all of our modeling was low. So low number of sales. Now, if we exceed the sales, that's great. That's a good problem to have. But what you don't want is, you don't want a cash flow crunch. You don't want you don't want to set yourself up with expectations or to build something that you can't afford. And so by creating low expectations for yourself, you're not going to set yourself up with obligations that you can't live up to. Only when you have success, and then that's a problem that you can build yourself out of by adding staff or by increasing your rates or other things like that. So that's been our approach at Bluestem is always underestimate what the not overestimate our expectations and likelihood, and it gives you it allows you a peace of mind. You don't want to go into this with some stress inducing future where you got to hit the numbers. You've got to hit the numbers, or else you're gonna fold. Your whole goal here is to be around for 100 years or more. And so you really need to set realistic expectations that you can step into.
And
Susan,
get
you
your
have a-
pricing right. Get your pricing right.
Yeah.
I appreciate the importance of making your pricing affordable for people if it's in your area, where if you've got a lower income area, do a sliding scale perhaps, or a something, but make sure your pricing of what people are paying for, whether it's however that people are paying for it, but make sure the pricing for doing this has a good cushion on it, because it just is gonna, you got to make this work. So, yeah.
Susan, you have a question or a comment? I think you're muted.
Mute.
You're muted, Susan.
We can't hear you.
There you are.
There you
We
go.
missed everything you said.
Okay, thank you. I was going to say this is amazing, and it does somewhat take the romance of having a natural burial ground, but that's all good. It's important that we know all this. The thing that just gets me, I mean, Jeff and Heidi, since I've started on this, desire to have a natural burial ground in Ontario, I've known about your and Heidi's goals, and Laura, I've read about this land that was your grandfather's, and then Jeff puts out a slide that's talking about what to do when it's full. And I just have to ask this question: why not grave renewal?
Well, it's not allowed by law here, so I've answered that.
When you say grave renewal, what's that? Replanting
Reuse.
people in the same, reuse in the same grave?
Like
Why?
in your state,
I
it's
mean,
not
what would
allowed?
It's not allowed in our state. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's not allowed in Florida?
And very few states, as far as I know, very few states do allow it. So I think obviously it's very important in Europe. And it's I think a viable concept, but it's just not there yet.
Oh, she just disappeared. Where'd she? Oh, there you are. Okay, you moved around on my screen. Yeah, I think for Florida, I know that double burials has a different licensing for like double stacked burials,
Stacking.
but I don't know if that's the same thing that is what you're talking about. I kind of feel like, 50 years from now, all of us, whatever us being the places that we're starting here, are probably going to be reevaluating lots of things. But going from here, since it's going to be some years before we're even close to filling up what we have available based on our current standards of, 300 per acre or whatever our standards are. We've got, some decades ahead of us of sales. So,
Right. Which is small in the big scheme of things, if you think about it, just decades. And
yeah.
okay, maybe, yeah, because I know that in Virginia they allowed, and they've got, so New Orleans has got grave renewal, Virginia's got grave renewal. So I didn't realize there were states that outright didn't allow it, as opposed to it hasn't been explored.
Every state has its own laws, and they're all different. They're
Yeah,
literally.
I'm pretty sure Florida does not allow it, but I think that there I think it is viable. And I think if you look at it in terms of conservation burial, on one hand, you know, a big part of conservation burial is to save as much land as possible. So if there's land to be saved, to me, an area where you have a conservation burial ground, low density and save more land for a while. But to your point, eventually, you know, what if you've saved as much land as you can? If you still want to continue conservation burial, that's where, and it's a sustainable kind of thing too, is grave renewal after 25 years or whatever is appropriate, 20, 25, 30 years. I think it could be done as a part of conservation burial, and I think that it would be an advantage to do it in conservation burial. Yeah.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Thank you.
Anna, you have a comment?
Yeah, I just
Question?
wanted to make a quick comment too, that I think is important to remember with conservation burial and this grave renewal question. Like, I agree with Freddie that, you know, with burial density, or maybe you have a small area, you want to be able to maximize, you know, potential profit returns to keep sustainably funding programs. But with conservation burial, you also want to acquire more land eventually to protect a wider area. And so I think some aspects of grave renewal align with our work, but there's a big part of it that is protecting as much land as possible.
We're using this as a tool to do that. Yeah.
Thanks, Anna.
Yeah.
And I think I have to say, you know, like for us, we don't have adjacent land to be purchased, where we border 18,000 acres of permanently already protected by the state land, a wilderness preserve. So that's kind of our bigger ecological connection of that large wildlife corridor of our neighboring preserve. But we don't have, you know, a piece of land with our eyes on it for purchasing. So I think, and we're also an intact ecosystem. We're not doing restoration. We are trying to maintain an ecosystem that already exists. But we're also finding, you know, 6 years in that each burial is an impact on the land. So we had a lady recently who's very sad, and she wants her husband brought back to Miami, and he was buried 18 months ago. And we're like, honey, we just, please don't do this, please. So we're looking at, you know, talking about what our fees are for, you know, and our policies around disinterment. So that's and part of that thing is, you know, we are impacting that piece of land. It's a little tiny square. It's a rectangle of, you know, 5 by 10. And we're kind of impacting where we put the dirt for the day. And that comes back because things heal pretty quickly here in terms of like cut down, smashed dirt pile. But the hole and all of that dirt that's repiled on there and those things growing back, even though we're replanting with seeds and letting it and trying to pull out bad weeds, but it's an impact. So we're dealing with disturbed site plants coming in that were not there before. And so there's some, you know, land conservation, restoration work on little tiny, each burial is kind of turning into a little tiny restoration spot. So that is going to make an impact on the big picture of these acres. They're not going to be the same as when we started, you know, because there's going to be 300 little impacts on each acre or so over time. So to then go back and re-impact them after however many years it takes to get them all back to good, you know, back to hopefully diverse, you know, ecosystem, recover those impacts. What would it mean to go back and then dig another one up, dig that hole up again? And then, you know, so that's where I'm, you know, I see where it makes sense if you've got, you know, like a conventional cemetery where you're opening up a mausoleum or a tomb, and just, you know, we're like in Europe where they go in, move the bones to the side, put the next family member, and bones to the side family, you know. But I don't know enough about it for here that to really speak on it, other than that is just something that I'm thinking about a lot, is you know, how is this going to look into the future 20 years from now? How is it going to be restored? How are these going to be recovered back to, you know, what impacts in the big picture are we making here? So, I mean, we're still saving the land. It's still better than, you know, it becoming condominiums, more condominiums or another shopping strip here, but it's not the same as it being a pure nature preserve. So.
Sorry. I also want to say that it's not an either or. I mean, I think these are all viable alternatives, or they all work together as part of the package. And so there's no only one way to do it, because, you know, Laura just described some of the ecological impacts of reburying or redisturbing an area, et cetera. And then there's land, and of course, in an urban area, you're going to be more likely, and that's part of the issue in Europe is, you know, Germany is the size of the state of Oregon, and they have a population of 85 or 90 million people. There is a density there that is going to require a different tool or a different method or a different strategy, and conservation burial might not work because there might not have the land to conserve to be able to even do that, but their burial practice is also a little different. So I think it's, you know, it's a good conversation to have, and land use I think is an important component as well. Conservation burial is in itself its own strategy, and you do it with reburial or you can do it without, and I think they're both work and they're both viable. But I love that conversation, and I love that question, and I think we need to be thinking about new strategies. What we're really trying to do is get away from something that is not sustainable, right? And conservation burial is one of those tools, and as is reburial or reuse of a burial space.
We are down to our final 5 minutes. I don't know if there are any closing thoughts or questions. We definitely appreciate all of you tuning in, not only to tonight's webinar, but to the previous 2 sessions. We are definitely appreciative, and just a reminder that you will be able to access copies of this webinar and the previous webinars. Again, it will take about a week, I think, before we can distribute the recording, but thank you for your patience on that. It will be sent out to your email directly from the Conservation Burial Alliance. So thank you all very much.
And good luck with everything, you guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whatever the webinar series will be next year, hope you'll join in on that and other things that we've got going and other meetings and stuff. And
definitely
being active members. We love it.
Yeah, give feedback if there are other topics that you would like to see addressed next year through webinars. Definitely give that feedback as well.
And good luck with all your projects. It's exciting. So
absolutely. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.
Are we staying on here?
I am.
Okay. I think Amy left. I just shut her out just because.
There you go. There you
I think
go.
she just
You have the power. She probably.
I think she probably just left, walked out of the room. So
yeah. So I thought that went well.
Yeah, I did too. That went really well. You guys were great. So that was good discussion. That was the best. Oh, well, let me see if we're.
How's your mom? Was today the surgery, right?
Yes, it was last Thursday.